The South Dorset Ridgeway is sometimes an eerie and atmospheric place where the ancient landscape is punctuated by lumps and bumps and standing stones left by our ancestors, who, it's said by some, long ago diminished to become the fairy folk, and those fairy folk are still living in the land. At one end of the Ridgeway, not far from the town of Weymouth, there's a round mound of earth called Bingham Hill. Sitting on the hill are a string of 9 Bronze Age barrows called Bingham Bumps, but for longer than that, they've always been known as the Singing Barrows. And the old folk who lived around in the villages, they knew that this was a place where the little people liked to come and make their midnight revels, singing and dancing together on the hilltops. Although hardly ever seen, the fairies often had their beguiling, bewitching music that could be heard, especially at certain times of the year, May Day or Midsummer or Halloween, when the veil between the worlds is stretched thin and the powers of the fairy folk are at their strongest. At such times, the local villagers stayed away from the singing barrows, and if they had to travel, they kept a pin in their pockets for fear of being pixie-led. However, once upon a time, there was a man who lived in the village of Bingham called Thomas Tinknell. And he was a man whose greed for gold was greater than his fear of the fairies. He thought to himself that if the fairies lived in the singing barrows, then they'd surely be hiding their treasures there as well. And so, as the days and weeks and months went by, he determined that he would find a way to pilfer some of that treasure for himself. And so one year, one warm evening in late June, with the sun already setting red across the Ridgeway hills, he picked his way up the grassy common between the golden firs and the purple heather, with a dog at his heels and a sharp spade across his shoulders. But as he arrived at the edge of Bingham Hill, his dog suddenly froze, ears erect, nose pointing stiffly down to the ground, and all of a sudden it let out an ear-piercing howl before turning around and running back home with its tail between its legs. Thomas called out and then cursed his dog, but there was nothing that he could do to make that dog return. So Thomas carried on alone, and as the full moon rose up into the sky, it was then that he heard the first strands of a lovely lilting music wafting gently on the breeze. He quickened his pace, marching uphill towards the sound, and then he lay down on the tusky grass on one of the barrows, listening to the enchanting music coming out from beneath the earth. Suddenly, as he lay there, a doorway opened in the side of the hill, and out came a golden glow of light, and behind, a dazzling array of fair folk, marching out of the barrow, pixies and elves and brownies and boggarts, knockers and oakmen, spriggans and sprites, all of them dressed in various shades of red and green. Some of them playing music on pipes and fiddles, some carrying trays of food and drink, and others pulling little carts of glinting gold or pushing wheelbarrows full of shining little jewels. Now the music was even louder and faster, the rhythm so insistent and so infectious, but before he knew it, and quite against his own will, Thomas jumped up onto his feet and was dancing a merry jig to the sound of the fairies' fiddles. But the little people turned their heads to look up and see who it was that had dared to come and disturb their secret celebration. Well, Thomas was unabashed. Why should I be afraid of folk so small when I myself am so big? And then, seizing his chance, he took off his broad-rimmed hat and threw it into the middle of the throng in the hope that he would secure some of their treasure for himself. Immediately, the music stopped. Thick clouds came in and covered the moon. And now, in the pitch black, Thomas felt his feet kicked away from under him. His body hit the ground hard, and then slender but strong ropes were thrown all over him, pinning him powerfully to the ground. But worse was yet to come. The fairy folk, they swarmed around him like ants, and then with hundreds of tiny swords and spears, they jabbed and stabbed him all over his body, and finally, the biggest of those spriggans jumped up onto his face, standing on his chin, and delivered a great vindictive kick to the tender tip of his nose. And then, With the sound of a tiny trumpet, the fairies retreated back through the doorway, returning underground once more, leaving Thomas Tinknell bound up and groaning loudly, staring in the dark with wide-eyed terror. All night long he lay there, in the cold and dark of the singing Barrow, until in the dawn the first fingers of sunlight crept across the land, and Thomas, looking around, found himself covered from head to toe in the delicate strands of spider's silk. His spade by his side was snapped in half, and there his upturned hat lying on the ground was filled with nothing but empty snail shells, whilst all around the long grass sparkled mockingly with diamond dewdrops. He returned home cold, tired, bruised from head to toe, and he never forgot the harsh lesson that he'd learned from the fairy folk on the singing Barrow. And from that day on, Thomas lost his lust for gold, and he was especially careful for the rest of his life to never ever offend the little people. Well, he told this tale as often as he could to as many people as would listen, which happened to be a great deal of people, because people in the West Dorset area have a great fondness for stories about the little people, and they told it to their grandchildren and their grandchildren, and eventually I heard it myself from an old man who lived not far from the village of Binkham, and he told it to me, and now I've told it to you, so it must be true.